It's the Outback QB Daily. We are continuing our season reviews, and today we are delving into the 3-14 season of the Tennessee Titans. Let's go. Good morning, everyone. Curtis DeBoy here on the Musclecat Media Network. Don't forget to check out our brand new show, the Outdoor Ginger Podcast. A young Danish man and his travels through the European mountains. He's a funny guy. He makes me laugh constantly, and I'm sure he will you too. Check that out, Outdoor Ginger Podcast. All right, let's have a look at the season of the Tennessee Titans. Now, they finished 3-14. We know by now that they have the number one pick in the 2025 NFL Draft, so they'll be going for a quarterback there because they don't have one, but we'll get into that in a second. It was their third non-playoff season in a row. They sacked their GM just a couple of days ago, Rand Carthorne. We know that by now too. They've kept Brian Callahan on for year two next year, but it was their first year without Mike Vrabel or Derrick Henry in a long, long time. And it was a confronting year for them in that regard, I think. They found out that Will Levis is not the answer. Mason Rudolph deputized, but they're starting again there, and that's what they're going to use that number one pick for. And the offense needs help. We'll delve exactly in what areas they need help in just a second. What is odd is that their defense was oxymoronic. Now, they had some real highlights and some real lowlights, but they were the second best defense in the league as far as yards conceded. Second best. Super stingy. Did not give up many yards. Only second to Philadelphia. But they were the third worst for points per game conceded. They were second in yards, 30th in points against. Bizarre. I don't think I've ever seen a differential like that, and it's hard to put your finger on exactly what that was. Well, it's actually not that hard. I think it's a lot of secondary weakness, to be honest. It's giving up in the red zone, and a lot of time that's secondary giving up big plays or giving up small plays near the red zone. It can be one of those two things, but either way, they give up scores big time and at the worst possible moments. And they were good against the pass as far as yards. They weren't good against the run as far as yards, but again, the scoring patterns don't reflect that, and neither do the individual performances. It's a really hard defense to figure out. But let's have a look, as we are with every team, at the highlights and the lowlights. We'll start with the highlights. Beating Houston in Week 12, that was big. It was in Houston. It was Levis's best game of the year, I think, or one of them anyway. And it was when Houston were a 7-4 team. I mean, they haven't been clicking really all year, but they were going better than Houston, 7-4. And a few of their struggles started from that game when they lost to Tennessee. Tony Pollard, he polled 4 votes in that game for 119 yards on the ground and a score. And Danielle Hunter for the Texans, he polled 5 in our MVP. The other highlight for the year for me was the reemergence or the breakout of Nick Westbrook-Akine as a better version of Marquez Valdez-Scantling, in that he just scores touchdowns. He just does 2 things a game, and they happen to be touchdowns. 2 receptions, 1 touchdown, 60 yards. That was his stat line for a few of those. He did have some big games, though. And he had a golden run of 8 touchdowns in 8 games. 8 in 8. It was extraordinary. It just kept on happening week after week. Lowlights for Tennessee. Well, there were a lot, but I'm just trying to keep to 2 for each team. The first one is that realizing that Will Levis is not the man. His constant big errors, particularly early in the season, it was really something that got Brian Callahan's goat, and it led to some strong conversations on the sideline between those two, and it just left the Titans going, okay, we are in a hole here. We are in a hole. The guy that we've been hanging out for in his second year, we went back with him. He's just not got it. He's got this ability to look good for a couple of quarters and then throws it all away in a couple of drives, and that just doesn't work in the NFL. This all culminated against Cincinnati when he went 8 of 12 passing, but of those 4 incompletions in that first half, 3 were interceptions, and he ended up with -6 fantasy points. Then he got dragged, and that was pretty much it. And number 2, the other low light that I've chosen, was the loss that set the tone, really, and would have been confronting for them, and that was Week 1. That was against Chicago. Do you remember? It was Caleb Williams' debut. They lost to the Bears in Chicago, and the Bears scored 14 points to none in that last quarter. But what made it humiliating was the fact that Caleb Williams, and I now concede this, I said it was solid at the time, but he had a bad game. He threw less than 50%, 14 of 29, and he threw for only 93 yards, and it was the defense and special teams that bailed Chicago out. But Tennessee, you just can't be losing that game when you're against a rookie quarterback who doesn't even crack the ton. But they lost it, and it was indicative of what was to come. Let's have a look at the stat leaders, because it's not all terrible. You can always pick out some positives as far as statistics are concerned. So Will Levis, he was their main QB, but he went 13 touchdowns to 12 interceptions, threw for 2,000 yards. Mason Rudolph went 9-9, and that was it. That's a pretty grim QB room. Rushing, it was good with Tony Pollard. He had a decent enough year. He went over 1,000 yards on the ground, 1,079. That's his third straight 1,000-yard rushing season, and it was his first year at Tennessee, coming across from Dallas, obviously, to replace the departing Derrick Henry from Tennessee. He went 4.2 yards per carry, 5 touchdowns on the ground. One thing that confuses me about this team is the use of Tajay Spears. He only got 84 carries compared to Tony Pollard's 216. And a lot of those were in the last game. He had about 20 carries in the last game of the year, probably 35 in the last 2 games, and most of his 300 yards came then as well. And he scored 4 touchdowns. This guy, he's a good player. And I think it's time they need to make him the number 1 running back. And I've traded him out. In fact, I traded him out at the wrong moment. I got Pollard in. Very bad mistake in fantasy. But I say that to say I'm not talking from a point of bias anymore, because I no longer own him in that fantasy competition. I am just looking at him as a young player and thinking, this guy's got talent. Pollard's now 27, 28. He's injury prone. They're not really going anywhere next year. So why don't you give the young guy the role? Because he looks capable. But they didn't use him much this year. So we'll see what they do next year. Receiving, I spoke about the Nick Westbrook-Akine breakout. So he had 9 touchdowns for the year, only 497 yards though. The leading yards receiver for them was Calvin Ridley, who had came across from Jacksonville, of course. And this was part of all that money that they spent in free agency, right? They're paying guys like Ridley. They're paying guys like Snead. They traded for him, the cornerback, and he got injured 6 weeks in and hasn't played since. And he was really bad when he played, to be frank. Ridley did crack 1,000 and 4 touchdowns, but outside of that, they've really not got much. Chigakonkwo was their leading tight end with 479 and 2 touchdowns. Outside of that, it's very, very lean, and they traded out DeAndre Hopkins too at the halfway point of the season. Defensively, it reads a little better. Now, Harold Landry, he had a good year. 9 sacks, the linebacker. 9 sacks, that's very nice. 15 tackles for loss as well. Arden Key, who I think I had him as my underrated player for the Titans in that episode I did on this show about a month ago. He had 6.5 sacks, and he just pops up at crucial moments. He's a really, really good player. Jeffrey Simmons, he was their best player of the year, I thought, their defensive tackle, and our votes reflect that. He had 5 sacks, 4 passes defended as well, 2 forced fumbles, 2 fumble recoveries. He was their big man that got them going when they needed. Kenneth Murray, the linebacker, had 3.5 as well. Sebastian Joseph Day on the D-line had 2.5. So they had a few guys that at least disrupted quarterbacks on the other side. And Armani Hooker, their safety, he was one of their best players for the year as well. 5 interceptions, 9 passes broken up. And a nice little bright spot, Jarvis Brownlee Jr., the cornerback, the rookie cornerback taken in the 5th round this year. He had 1 interception, but he broke up 9 passes as well. So that's a pretty good debut season for a cornerback. Yeah, he gave up some plays, but you look at that and go, okay, that's pretty good. We can take some positives out of that. Another positive, and I love mentioning this, was their kicker, Nick Folk. He went 21 of 22 field goals this year, 95%, and he didn't miss an extra point. That's basically the stat leader in kicking this year. Extraordinary. So great season for Nick Folk. At least there's some positivity there. Let's have a look at their draft. We'll go to their MVP votes first while we're talking about stats. Like I said, Jeff Simmons, the DT, what a man. He's a talisman. He polled 20 votes. And I must say, the Titans scored only 67 votes in the MVP for the year. That's the lowest of any team, which makes sense. They ended up with the number 1 draft pick, so the system checks out. But Jeffrey Simmons got 20, and he surpassed Tony Pollard, who ended on 18. Simmons surpassed him in the last week to become you can call it the best and fairest for the Titans for the Stubby Club Outback QB MVP award. He had 3 best on grounds. He polled 5 times. Pollard polled 6 times for 18 votes. And then it was a big gap down to Calvin Ridley, who scored only 6 despite polling 3 times. And then the rest was just guys that polled once. Nick Folk, Tavondre Sweat, Jack Gibbons, Quandre Diggs, Harold Landry, Jarvis Brownlee, a couple of rookies in there. Sebastian Joseph Day, Kenneth Murray, Jerome Baker, Will Levis. When you only have 1 quarterback poll 1 vote for the year, you've lost a lot of games. You've lost a lot of games. Their draft class. There were some positives here. JC Latham, he played the whole year at left tackle, which the number one thing you want out of your left tackle in year one is snaps, and he got those. Number two is that you want him to show in some games that he has the ability to keep his quarterback clean. And he did that a couple of times. He never had a 100% efficiency game, which is, you would like a couple in there. He had a few games where he only allowed one pressure. By the way, when I say 100% efficiency game, I mean no pressures allowed. So no sacks, no hits, no hurries. And then sometimes I add no penalties onto that as well. He wasn't too bad with penalties, except he had one game where he gave up 3, which really inflated his stats. He did allow 47 pressures for the year, which is high. That puts him in the top 6, 7, 8 O-linemen for the year. But he is a rookie left tackle playing every game pretty much. So, in fact, he did play every game. So you can understand that would be high when you're under that sort of pressure every week. Conceded 7 sacks, but there were stretches. He went, a month at a time on 2 occasions where he didn't concede a sack. So that wasn't terrible. There's certainly some hope. It's not as bad as some other tackles that we've seen in their first year recently. So you'll say JC Latham, he gets a pass. You want to see him improve next year, their first-round pick. Devondre Sweat, their defensive tackle. Now, he's picked up a bit of cult status. He's looking all right. He did some good things alongside Jeffrey Simmons. They might need someone else on the edge in the draft next year. It's not their number one priority, but they could use some help on the D-line. But with Devondre Sweat, he had a season that, again, you look at and go, okay, this guy's got some talent. He was their second-round pick. He had a really nice stretch where he went 3, 3, 3, 2, and 4 pressures within 5 games. And that was a good, strong stretch. He had a couple of sacks in there. He had a couple of stops on the ground. He had a forced fumble. So you looked at Devondre Sweat, particularly in the second half of the year, and thought, okay, they've got that pick right. So with Latham and Sweat, not a bad 1 and 2. Outside of that, like I said, Jarvis Brownlee was their other notable performer. He was taken in the 5th round, and he had a pretty good year as far as rookie corners are concerned. We spoke about L'Jarius Sneed. He was their big trade in the offseason, got injured. We spoke about Ridley. We spoke about Pollard in for Henry. They're in a transitional phase now. So what do they do with those guys? What do you do with Sneed, who's recovering from an injury? Do you keep him around because you've traded for him, he's on bigger money? Do you keep Ridley around? I think you do. You need some pieces, you need some weapons, some stability for a new quarterback coming in. So what do they need to do in the offseason, Tennessee, to ensure they're not in this position in 12 months' time? Well, let's look at areas of the ground. Their linebackers were good. Landry, Key, Murray, they're all good there. The defensive line, like I said, not too bad. Maybe need some help on the edge, but that wasn't too bad. The secondary, though, outside of Amani Hooker, really struggled. And in particular, the cornerbacks when they lost Sneed. But even when Sneed was playing, he wasn't good. So I think they need quality talent at cornerback. The O-line, it was awful for most of the year, but then just got going at the end. And that came because JC Latham gave him a bit of encouragement, but the big thing was Peter Skoronski. So Skoronski, he was their first-round pick from last year. He's playing at guard this year, and last year he was really bad. He had a bad first year, and people thought, oh no, he's a bust. And for most of this year, it looked that way as well, until for the last 6 or 7 games, he actually got going and had the best PFF grade of all guards in the competition in the last month. So Skoronski, it seemed to just click for him at the end. So if they've got Latham and they've got Skoronski, then that's 2 parts of the puzzle, but there's 3 other spots in that O-line that they need some better talent at. So I think that's going to be a need. And wide receivers as well. Yes, they've got Ridley. Yes, Westbrook Akine had that streak, but he's not a guy you can rely on. And beyond that, they don't have much. They have Tyler Boyd, who's in his early 30s, approaching mid-30s soon enough, who's injured and didn't do much this year. So in order, quarterback obviously is their number 1 need. I think cornerback second. I think O-line third to help out those rookies, get some proven experienced performers in, maybe in free agency, and then a wide receiver as well. So as expected, a lot of work to do because they had the worst record. There's always going to be big holes. But what can Brian Callahan do? And what can their new general manager do? And who do they pick at quarterback? It's going to be very interesting. Their season wasn't interesting. They were so boring to watch. But their off-season will be. All right. We'll see you tomorrow.